Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women, and we are here to talk about a history-making election in Mexico. On Sunday, Claudia Sheinbaum won the Mexican presidential election and became the first woman in her country to become president. She is also the first Jewish person to hold the role. Here to talk more about her victory and what it means for Mexico is Will Freeman. He's a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is in Mexico City right now. Will, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so you're speaking live from Mexico City. You were there for the elections last night. Tell us, what are you seeing on the ground, and what is the mood of the electorate right now?
On the one hand, this was a landslide that most people saw coming. If you looked at the polls, Claudia Sheinbaum was holding a between 10 and 20, 25-point lead above her nearest rival for weeks. So this has been a campaign without a lot of suspense. Most people thought they knew where it was going. On the other hand, I would say that there was still enthusiasm. I went around several different neighborhoods of Mexico City yesterday, talking to voters. I think overall, their responses matched up pretty much with what we saw in the election. The fact that 60% of voters supported Claudia Sheinbaum to the next candidate's 30%. So it really was a landslide for the ruling party.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of Mexican politics, can you just give us a very brief overview of the structure of the Mexican government for those who might not be familiar with it? And is it structured similarly to the American government?
Somewhat similarly. It's also a presidential system. In Mexico's case, until now, with multiple political parties, not just two. So what you have here is a strong presidency. The president can hold office for 6 years and cannot be reelected after that. That's a very strong norm here in Mexico. So Claudia Sheinbaum will have 6 years ahead of her, and that's it. Now, in addition to the president, there's a Senate, a Congress, and also a Supreme Court, which for now is selected through a judicial process independently, but which Claudia Sheinbaum and her party have suggested should be actually selected through popular vote. So that is one proposal we may see put soon to Congress, is whether or not to reform the Constitution to elect Supreme Court judges and actually also elect the people who administer the entire judiciary. That change could make the system look quite unlike that of the United States and most other democracies.
A popular vote for the judiciary, that blows my American mind. But while we're on policy, Will, can you tell us what were the other policies that Sheinbaum ran on, and what was her strategy broadly going into this election?
Look, her biggest message was that she is here to continue the policies of the president who's held power for the last 6 years, a man named Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, sometimes called AMLO. AMLO is a nationalist populist. He started governing, began his political career as a governor in a very poor state of southern Mexico. Ran every political campaign against the political elites and what he perceived as kind of a wealthy few controlling the country. And eventually he won in 2018, also in a landslide. He became quite popular before and then as he held the presidency by hiking the minimum wage, by increasing social transfers and cash transfers to the poor, but also very controversial. He empowered the military. He was very harsh on defenders of the environment. So he combined views that we sometimes think of as right wing and left wing. Now, Sheinbaum has basically said that she's going to continue those policies. She's been by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador's side for the past 24 years, excuse me, one of his closest political allies. However, Sheinbaum herself has a very different profile, which makes people think that maybe she has different ideas about where the country should go. She's a climate scientist. She comes from the student movement in Mexico, which is much more, let's say, traditional kind of leftist in the sense of caring deeply about human rights, considering themselves progressives, somewhat closer to the mold of those in the US. So we'll see. Sheinbaum may make, I think, important changes on energy policy, on fiscal policy, potentially on the environment. But I think no matter what she does, though, she will be trying to sustain this legacy of AMLO and appeal to that same base.
I have spoken to one or two members of the Forbes global audience, someone who lives in Mexico. And when you talk about that legacy, this person said to me that Mexican citizens that she's around are feeling a great deal of uncertainty and are very worried. I think in part because of the large majority that Sheinbaum's party holds right now. But what have you been hearing? Are people concerned, and do these concerns resonate with you?
Well, it's a divided country. But I think what you do see in the election results is that there's a strong majority that likes the direction that Lopez Obrador has taken the country, for good or for ill. What is disconcerting, I think, to the minority of opposition supporters or of Lopez Obrador and Sheinbaum critics is that the political party of Lopez Obrador and Sheinbaum has grown so quickly that they argue that it's not leaving space for many other checks and balances for other political parties that might balance things out. I think it's going to be a really tough road ahead for critics of this government, this party, because unfortunately their political parties have lost a lot of credibility. They're almost going to start to have to build from the bottom up. I think connecting at the grassroots with those who've been disadvantaged by Lopez Obrador's policies. And it'll probably take a really long time. The critics, I think there's some real concerns, they have some valid concerns, but we have to recognize after this election, they are firmly in the minority.
Indeed, the numbers are strongly in Sheinbaum's favor. Now, we talked about the historic nature of the fact that she is a woman, but she is also the first Jewish person to be elected president of Mexico. This is a country that is, according to the most recent statistics on the matter, 78% Roman Catholic. Will, do you know, is she the first Jewish president of a majority Catholic country?
I think that she might be. You also have the case of Javier Milei in Argentina, who's converted to Judaism recently. As far as I'm aware, in terms of having a deep family history in that tradition, Sheinbaum would be the first in Latin America. Now, it is, I think, important to note that she considers herself secular. Her family were refugees from Eastern Europe, both for their religious identity and their political views. And she grew up in a secular household. So on the campaign trail, she's emphasized shared values among Mexicans, including that Catholic heritage. So it hasn't been, I would say, a major talking point or theme in the campaign here, except for a few very ugly attacks you saw, alleging that she was not Mexican enough by some of her critics.
So is there significance for the Jewish people of Mexico or even beyond in her election, do you think?
I'm sure there is. I think that it shows that in Latin America writ large, we're seeing an increasingly diverse pool of people holding office. Keep in mind that it's extremely significant that Mexico just elected its first woman president, but this is following in the path of Brazil, of Chile, of Argentina, of Costa Rica. This is a world region that leads, for instance, the US and parts of Europe by quite a bit when it comes to women's representation in politics. And also you're seeing increasingly indigenous people and indigenous political parties elected. A number of different groups that didn't traditionally tend to hold power have tended to see their representation expand because of democracy. So I think that that's one thing which we can point to as a real advance and as honestly a strong point for Latin America, even as we're all aware of the many other challenges this region faces, from slow economic growth to organized criminal violence.
Are there lessons that the United States should be taking from her victory when it comes to electing women?
I mean, I think, of course, it would be ideal if our country were moving quicker in that direction. Certainly now, if we do catch up, and I hope we do, it'll be after this long list of countries that I've just mentioned. In the Americas, this long list of democracies.
Now, just this afternoon, President Biden indicated that he intends to sign an executive order that will limit asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border. I don't know, has Sheinbaum commented on this? And perhaps more broadly, what does her election mean for US-Mexico relations?
No, not that I've seen. She's just the election is here. It's just wrapping up. So really the focus has been domestic. Look, I think migration in Mexico, there's two things to say about this issue. One is that Mexico is often enlisted to do the enforcement that the US doesn't want to do or can't do, or simply needs Mexico's cooperation to do. So the Mexican border officials and immigration authorities are extremely involved in detaining immigrants that are headed down towards the US, to detaining irregular migrants, to deporting them further south. And that's become, a hallmark of governments here going back years. But Lopez Obrador has recently really stepped things up. Since January, the enforcement against irregular migrants traveling through Mexico has increased. That's why we've seen fewer migrants showing up at the US-Mexico border. There's actually been quite a significant drop. I think it'll depend if Sheinbaum continues some of those strong enforcement policies, whether that trend will continue. Now, that said, the second point I would mention is that Mexico is increasingly a destination country for migrants, both migrants who want to make it to the US and end up having no means to go further, building lives here, and those who seek asylum here from Central American countries and from further south. So Mexico is now becoming an important host country to migrants. That is creating some friction, some challenges. I think it's also an opportunity for the country. This is an aging country that needs more young workers. I think there's certain advantages to the fact that more and more people are seeing opportunity here in Mexico. Sheinbaum, I think, will try to work with whoever is elected the next US president, whatever his migration policy might be. But I do think that with a second Trump term, there could be definite tensions. I know Sheinbaum's team would not look kindly, for instance, on the reimposition of a policy called Remain in Mexico, which had asylum seekers essentially forced to wait on the Mexico side of the border. Look, in northern Mexico, that creates all types of really troublesome, disturbing dynamics even. There's large-scale migrant kidnapping by organized crime groups. Obviously, this puts stress on local communities. So Mexico views that as a bit of a vulnerability. And I think that the more extreme the next president is on migration and on really trying to lock down the US border, regardless of the costs, the more friction that could create with the Sheinbaum government.
So it sounds like the November elections in the US could have a real impact on her term, or at least 4 years of her term. If it's Biden, it's kind of the status quo, but if it's Trump, it's a return to extremist policies that make her job more difficult.
Yeah, and it's worth noting here that AMLO, interestingly enough, despite considering himself a leftist, had a very friendly relationship with Donald Trump, and sometimes continues to suggest that he has a friendly relationship. Sheinbaum, I think there will be more friction again because she comes from the student movement, this human rights focused left, because she is herself a scientist, right? I think that there are a number of personal factors there that could make their relationship quite tough. Her team is still being careful to say, we'll work with anybody. And frankly, that's the way it has to be. The US and Mexico are each other's largest trading partners. We share a very long land border, of course, and we're just deeply integrated as countries. So of course that cooperation needs to be there, regardless of who's in office. But again, I do think that that it may be rougher down the road between Sheinbaum and, let's say, a second Trump term than it was between her predecessor AMLO and Donald Trump his last time around.
What's the number one thing you expect to see from her in her first term?
I think that, again, I expect to see her pledging to continue López Obrador's most popular policies. Those were, again, increasing the minimum wage. There's another increase planned for next year. Those include cash transfers to the youth of Mexico and to older adults, universal cash transfers. But I think that she's also going to have to figure out how to finance all this. Now, López Obrador was very careful with financing, with balancing the budget his first years in office. However, his last year, he started to spend big. Many people believe with the idea of turning out the vote, and which seems to have worked pretty effectively for him. But now Sheinbaum is left with a pretty tricky fiscal situation, the highest debt to GDP ratio in Mexico for several years, and I think decades. So she's going to probably have to make some cuts somewhere. She may have to pass a tax reform, which will be politically difficult. So it'll be, again, that balance between sustaining what made AMLO popular in terms of economic and social policy, but also figuring out how to make it more sustainable for the long run.
Excellent. Well, Will Freeman, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your insight.